have to tell you my latest exciting discovery, because I can't even believe it, and it just happened.
We're speaking with distinguished Professor Patricia Wright from Stony Brook University, and she is also the founder and executive director of the Centre ValBio Research Station in Madagascar. So welcome, Professor Wright. Could you please share a brief overview of your career in research?
I started my career a little late in life. I had actually been a social worker before I became a biologist. I became very intrigued with a monkey that I found in New York at a pet store. And that led me on a long journey to South America, to Peru and Paraguay, to try to find out in the wild what this monkey was evolved to be. It was a nocturnal monkey. You know, I mean, there's only one nocturnal monkey in the whole world. And I wanted to know why an animal who had ancestors that were day active would go back into the night and to feed and to raise its offspring. And so that was my dissertation project. Then after that, I got my first postdoc, and that was at Duke University. And that's where I learned about lemurs and how important lemurs are to our understanding of early ancestors of primates.
So what would you consider your greatest research achievement or the accomplishment that you're most proud of during your career?
When I got to Madagascar, I was going there to look for an animal that was extinct. We thought, maybe. I had to find out whether it was or not, and that was the greater bamboo lemur. But what happened was that I discovered a new species of lemur, a new species to science. And that was an extraordinary moment to realize that this was an animal that nobody had ever seen before. So in some ways, that was one of my most important pieces of research. It was finding it and then studying it and realizing that this animal actually was a bamboo eater, and the bamboo that they ate was filled with cyanide, which is a toxin that could kill you if you ate one bite. But they eat this cyanide-filled bamboo all day long. 95% of their diet consists of that. So then the research question became, how could an animal, how could that be that they can eat that many toxins and tolerate it? And then that a strange thing happened, because suddenly the timber exploiters came into the forest and started to chop down the forest. Then I had to switch gears and go to the capital of Antananarivo, the capital of Madagascar, and ask the head of the Department of Water and Forest if he could stop the cutting. And he said, well, yes, I did give them concessions, and they're legally there. If we want to make this a protected area, it's going to take a lot of funding, because we're Madagascar, we don't have that funding. So the next step was for him to ask me to get that funding. And that moment was when I kind of had to decide whether I was going to do conservation or science. That's what I thought. But I decided at that moment I was going to do conservation and science. So those are a couple of the highlights of my early career. Those, decision-making moments, discovering a new species and becoming famous for that, and then also finding the funding to make Ranomafana National Park.
Just curious more about the story about the species you originally went to look for. It's a closely related, it's another baboon lemur, and then you found a different species in the same, they're both living together in the same habitat, is that correct? As well as a third bamboo lemur?
Yes. A couple weeks later, we actually found the one that I had come to find, the greater bamboo lemur. So we actually had both of these extraordinary species of bamboo-eating lemur in the same forest. So
Which moment was more exciting, the finding the one you originally went to find, or finding one that you weren't expecting to be there at all?
both of them were just extraordinary because, it was one thing after another. It was like being in an Alice in Wonderland world where all these strange things were happening and discoveries were happening, and it seemed almost unreal, but it was lots of fun. I really enjoyed those moments.
That links me to the next question about the how research in Madagascar has changed since you first began working there.
Yes, it's amazing. When I went to Madagascar, my main tools were a pair of binoculars, and I just watched the animals. But now, when primatologists, including me, go into the field, I mean, there's so many other tools that we have. I mean, we have these radio collars that can tell us where the animals are. And, accelerometers are attached so you can tell how fast the animals are going, and you can tell their health and their heart rates. And so that, there's a lot of information that we never could have had before. Also, of course, genetics. When I first went to find them, it was very difficult to do any genetics, so we didn't know very much about it at all. But now, when you can get the whole genomes of the animals that you're studying, and I'm really interested in behavior and ecology, so it's really interesting to me to tie that behavior into their hormones, to really understand, how much food they're eating and what the nutrition is of the food. All these things we can do now that we just couldn't do then. And, you can take a conservation drone and see, the state of the forest. For example, one of the top feeding trees of the lemurs recently has gotten a fungus disease. It came in, it's invasive from Mauritius, and it's been killing some of the trees inside the forest, even though the forest is protected. And so we have to now deal with that. There's always a challenge or two, but we've discovered that because of our long-term monitoring, and then we were able to look at the extent of that fungus by using the conservation drone. And so a lot more technology, and that makes it even more exciting. You can find out even more information.
So the next question was about, you already touched on the golden baboon lemur, but I was curious about adaptations to the cyanide, and I mean the diet consisted of mainly one group of vegetation. What the adaptations were for that you've discovered with your research, but also one of the other species you looked at in your career, the Milne-Edwards Sifakas.
Well, first of all, with the cyanide, it's much more complex than we ever thought. And we're still trying to figure out exactly how that little animal can do that, actually detoxify cyanide, because it's one of the few animals in the world that can. As for the Milne-Edwards Sifaka, well, we've been studying their demography now for 30 years. And so we've been looking at, their feeding and their behaviors. We've discovered that they have territories that seem to be standard throughout their, not just their lifetime, but the lifetime of generation after generation. And when an animal reaches reproductive age, they leave those territories and try to join another group, and that often involves a male going into a new group and killing the infants in the new group, which was kind of brutal when we first saw it, but it is a strategy to for him to have more offspring. So we've watched that through the years. It happens, every time that there's a group changeover. So in the
Is that common in? Oh, sorry. Is that common in other lemur species, or is that particular to this species in Madagascar?
There's several lemur species where we've seen it now. This was the first time we saw it, was in the Milne-Edwards Sifaka, but there's several other species. And we see that it occurs when the group size gets large and new animal comes in. But I think the important part of it is that what we're seeing is there's more of the group changes when there's fragmentation in the environment. Outside the Ranomafana National Park, there's smaller fragments of forest, and in those forests, you have more turmoil, more changing of groups, and more infanticide, and it's a real problem, as you can imagine. It's not just a problem of less food because the fragments are smaller and more disturbed, but also it disrupts the whole social behavior, and therefore there's more internal aggression and problems with infanticide.
Topic to another area of your research on fossil material. You've worked a lot at the Christmas River site, so I was interested to hear more. I know you found extinct or recently extinct fossil lemurs there, and also potential evidence for the earliest human occupation in Madagascar, potential cut marks on elephant bird remains. So I wondered if you could talk through that research and kind of what's the latest on that.
Right. I study living lemurs, but I've known, since the time that I was in graduate school, that there's an incredible megafauna of animals that lived on Madagascar very recently, a couple hundred years ago, maybe 500 years ago. And that consists of 17 species of giant lemur, some the size of chimps, some the size of gorillas, others the size of baboons, 17 species. And what we know about, and also the world's largest bird, which is the elephant bird, an extinct crocodile, the horned crocodile, the mother of all crocodiles, and hippopotamus, 2 species of dwarf hippopotamus. So I knew about these fossils, and I'd seen some of the bones because my friends had shown them to me. But and I also knew that people came from Borneo 2,000 years ago, and that's when most of the fossils are dated at 2,000 years ago, from 2,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago, which is very recent. And so they had cut marks on their bones, and we realized that people, when they came, were eating these large animals. Then one day, somebody called me up on the phone and said that they had 2 tons of dinosaur bones. And he was a sapphire miner, and he worked in the sapphire mines, and he had found all these bones. And I didn't believe him, to tell you the truth, but then I did go there. And actually it took 15 men 15 days to dig 15 meters deep. It's really deep. And then there was no bones. And then suddenly 15 meters deep, there was just like a layer of bones. And that was in a very, slate gray kind of smelling. It really smelled like marsh. And it was, I think it was a marsh where they all died. And it was, to me, it was wonderful because I had found a whole ecosystem, because there were apiornis, the world's largest bird, 10 feet high. There were all kinds of hippos, crocodiles, tortoises, lemurs, everything in the same layer. I was very, very excited. And then, why? Because I had found a whole ecosystem that was before humans came. Because humans came 2,000 years ago. And when we actually dated every one of those bones, we dated the hippos, the crocodiles, the tortoises, the lemur, everything was dated at 10,000 years ago, way before people were supposed to have come. And so I thought that was great, because I could look at what was happening in the ecosystem before people. And then one day there was a British graduate student who said that he wanted to come and look at my bones, which I had collected and kept at the Centre ValBio research station. He wanted to come and look at the elephant birds, the largest the largest bird to ever walk the earth, to just, measure the bones. And I knew they were 10,000 years old. So, he wanted to see if they'd gotten bigger or smaller in those years. Okay, so he arrives in Ranomafana. I reach into the cabinet and hand him one of those big bones. And he looks at it and he says, "You know what you have here?" And I said, very proudly, I'm not a paleontologist, but I wanted him to know I knew the Latin name. I said, Apiornis maximus. And he looked at me and he said, no, that's not what I mean. And he pointed to these cut marks, tool marks. And I said, no, it's not possible. These are 10,000-year-old bones. And you're telling me that these are cut marks from humans? And so we took those bones, with permits, of course, and we took them to the Smithsonian, and they said, yeah, I think so. It looks like cut marks. Took them to National Geographic. They agreed. Took them to Richard Leakey, and he said, no question. Those are made by humans. And then we eventually wrote that paper saying that there had to be people that were living on Madagascar 10,000 years ago, way before these latest people arrived. And we know that because we've checked the genetics. A geneticist looked at the genes of living people and verified that they came from the Bornean group from 2,000 years ago, and also another group of Africans, Bantu, who came 1,000 years ago. But nothing, no genes from those people that lived there 10,000 years ago. So my big project now is to go back to that site, to those sapphire mines, and actually look at what, can we find evidence of the people? Can we find tools? Can we find bones of those people? And so that's one of my future projects.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask if there's ongoing research in that to try and find
I've been back.
Human remains.
Yeah, I've been back there a couple of times because I want, people don't always want you to be, searching for bones and things in Madagascar. So I want to make sure that the people are okay with it before we go back. But then I have to tell you my latest exciting discovery, because I can't even believe it, and it just happened. I have a graduate student. Her name is Florence, and she's from Cameroon. And she came and she said she wanted to work on a project in Madagascar. So I said, to start out your PhD program, why don't you go to the northern part of Madagascar, northern part of Ranomafana National Park. This is the national park that, I had been all around to the whole park, but we hadn't been up in the north recently. So Florence, you go back to the north and see what is the population density of Milne-Edwards Sifakas. So she goes there, spends 3 months, comes back, and she says, it's amazing. There's Sifakas there. They're beautiful, and they're, the group size is this, and etc. And then at the end, she said, there are caves up there. And I said, I don't think there's caves up there. I was there all throughout the 80s and the 90s. I never saw caves. She said, I said, how do you know that there were caves? And she said, I took a course at Stony Brook. And Dominic Stratford from South Africa, he's in charge of the Sterkfontein caves. Dominic Stratford taught me what a cave looks like. They're caves. I said, okay. And then I was telling this story at dinner when I was at the Centre ValBio research station. And, Michael, my other student, said, oh, I know about searching for caves. And then MJ said, yeah, I've been to caves all over the world. And then Alicia said, I study sedimentology. And then my husband, who was there, says, I've got ropes. So the next morning, they climbed the mountain and they found that cave. I was busy having meetings. They came back off that mountain and they said, we found something in the caves. I said, what? They said, yeah, we found bones. I said, what were they? And they said, well, we're not sure. We think they were maybe forced hogs or something, pigs. And I said, okay, did you take a picture? And they showed me the picture. It was a skull and the mandibles and the molars and the tusks. And I said, this is no pig. This is a hippopotamus. Now you have to realize that there are no fossils in all of Madagascar that come from the eastern rainforest, because eastern rainforest is not good for fossilization, and the bones just disappear. And here they were in our national park. And it was like, it was impossible. And I said, wow. And this is because this is the only time you have a hippopotamus that died in the place where it, the habitat where it lived, because these rainforests have not changed in, thousands and thousands of years. Wow. So this was pretty exciting. So I called in two paleontologists from the University of Antananarivo. That's one thing I did. I contacted the Leakey Foundation and told them I needed an emergency grant quick because we had to investigate this. Then I called up Dominique Stratford and I said, this is all your fault. If you hadn't taught Florence about caves, we would never have found this. Please come. And so we got the money, and Dominic flew over from the States where he was teaching. And we got the two professors from University of Tana, and we went back into those caves. And with the permission, of course, of the National Park Service, because it's their caves are within their jurisdiction. It's amazing. There's 13 caves. And we went to Florence's cave, and that's where we found limb bones, and as well as the skull and the teeth and the mandibles. Then and Toussaint's cave, we found more hippopotamus, and there's 13 more. So we're hoping that in June that we'll be able to go back there and keep looking. I want to see lemurs, of course. I want to see some subfossil lemurs in those caves and find out. We don't even know whether this is, I think this is a new species of hippo, because the measured against the other hippos that we have, the skull is actually smaller and the legs are longer. So, it's really an interesting hippopotamus. But who knows what we're going to find. There's sediments there, and below there's a marsh. And when I called up James Hansford, the graduate student, and now has his PhD and is working in England, and he said that he was going to come and help us, because if you look at Google Earth, you can see that below those caves is a marsh. And many fossils have been found in marshes. So he's all excited about coming over and doing it. So anyway, this just happened. I mean, the fact that...
So you're going to be doing a lot more fossil material in the next few years then?
Yes. I mean, I never thought, I'm trained as a primatologist, but I'm doing a little bit of paleontology too. It's really great.
When did the hippopotamuses on Madagascar, when was like the last known, like the most recent they were there?
1,000 years ago they were there. 1,000 years ago, maybe 800 years ago. But we have, I do a lot of exploration. And when I do exploration, I always ask the elders, well, have you ever seen something big? And if they say yes, and I listen to their descriptions, it's, it's something big. It's very dark. It's usually in the water, but it's very fierce, and it'll come out of the water and it will chase you. They have descriptions. They don't have any descriptions of anything that I would call a lemur, and they don't have any descriptions of this giant elephant bird. But I have heard stories about, or George, my guide, told me once. He said, my grandfather said that his grandfather said to beware of the animals that come out, the big animals that come out of the rivers, because they can't see very well. And when they run after you, just realize that you have to get out of their way but they can't see you. And maybe you should just, go in a ditch and they'll run right over you. So there have been these stories about this.
Might be a lot more recent than the fossil record indicates.
Yes, but we don't know until we date that the hippo that we found, and then we have to, that's our next step, is dating that hippo and finding more bones.
These are quite far in terms of the logistics to get the equipment and stuff. Is that quite a challenge for this upcoming excavations?
It's inside the park, and you go up a couple mountains and it's right there, so that my teams can get up there in 2 or 3 hours. That's amazingly close. For everything else in Madagascar, you have to drive for days and walk for days. But we found fossils where you have to walk for 2 or 3 hours from the main road. That's crazy.
The ideal location as well.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And then the government is really excited about it, and they want to make a museum so they could feature the only fossil in the rainforest, and just having a hippo, that's pretty amazing. And I think it's probably a new species. We'll see about that. Gotta get those genes, and we'll see what the dates are. I mean, the dates make such a difference. I don't know.
Do you have an idea? Like, what's your inkling that what dates it's going to come out as?
Well, I asked the paleontologist, Dominique Stratford. I said, "What do you think? I know you've been working in South Africa, but what do you think about this?" And he said he thinks it's hundreds of years old, not thousands of years old. But you can't tell. You just look at a bone. It's really hard to tell.
Going back to primates, but species you've studied out of Madagascar. So, earlier in your career, looking at things like tarsiers and South American monkeys. So I was just curious about that research and how you got into these different groups of primates.
I originally went after I got my I was in the process of writing my PhD when Dr. Simons called me up from Duke, and he said, I need somebody that's going to go to Borneo and look for tarsiers and bring tarsiers back. And because I had those monkeys that I had traveled with, people had told him that I was the person that would be able to go get those animals. So it was incredible because I'd always wanted to go to Borneo. It's a fascinating island. And when I got there, I was just intrigued with all of the animals that island has that I had never seen before. And we would go out, the government, the Forestry Service, and I would go out trapping them outside protected areas. And we trapped 12. And we trapped them by using mist nets, like you're trapping birds. And the tarsiers, they have really long legs, and they spend a lot of time jumping from trunk to trunk, looking for large insects and lizards, and they eat small animals. They have huge eyes, and they have long legs, and just fascinating creatures. And we would catch them and we would bring them back to the protected area where we built cages to keep them in. But then I had to catch food for them. And so I would be spending all my days going out and catching huge, orthopterans and things, grasshoppers and things like that for them to eat, or lizards and geckos. And it was really quick because I had to get 12. And once I got 12, I could go back to the States. So I really am always grateful to the Forestry Service for helping me out, because we would go down rivers and go into areas and put up the mist nets. Mosquitoes. Oh, there were so many mosquitoes and leeches, and it was like quite a challenge. And we got them, we brought them back to Duke, and then Dr. Simon says, okay, that's one species, but it'd be really much more interesting science if you went back and got a second species and compared their social behavior.
So you
So
went straight back.
I went back to Philippines this time. And in the Philippines, I captured the Philippine tarsiers and brought them back. And so we built special cages for them. And it was very interesting because the ones that on Borneo were monogamous, and they would, sleep together together in the cages and forage apart. But because I had a little habitat cages for them, so I would go out in North Carolina, capture all kinds of big insects and even praying mantises and things, and bring them back to give to the tarsiers, and then and also they would eat mealworms. But anyway, so I was watching, and then the other species was not monogamous at all. All the females slept in separate places, and the males would go and sleep with a different female like every night. And he would just go like female A the first night, female B the second night, female C the third night, and it just rotate. And they seemed to think that was fine. So it was interesting that they have very different social systems, even though they're eating pretty much the same kinds of food, and they eat only live animal prey. That's why I had to keep going out there and catching animals, because they'd eat living mealworms. But if I put like hamburger or something else out there, and try to attach a string or something to make it look alive, they would never be fooled. And one time I put some fish in their fish bowl, little tiny guppies things, and they actually captured the fish. They grabbed them and ate them.
Oh, and ate them. So just the movement of the fish was enough to.
Oh, yeah, they're
Wow.
really fierce predators. I mean, it's good that there's not a giant one of those.
Yeah, and it would look pretty scary as well.
Yeah, no, tarsiers are amazing creatures and some of our most ancient primate relatives.
And the Borneo and the Philippine, how closely related are the different tarsiers? Like the evolutionary timescales involved in the tarsier evolution.
We think that they are some of the most ancient of living primates. That they come back from very, very early ancestors. Almost at the time, some of their characteristics are like monkeys, and some of them are like lemurs. But their eyes are so big because they don't have a tapetum lucidum. They don't have that reflective shield that the lemurs have, which is primitive. And some of the females' reproductive organs are much more like a monkey's than a lemur's, and they have a combination of traits make them a very curious animal. And from everything, from studying their genetics, they're very old. Their ancestors are very old, and also even for lemurs, because lemurs, when they arrived, the genetics say that they arrived 50 million years ago on Madagascar, and that they've been evolving ever since that. There's 110 species of lemurs, and and they're very ancient ancestors.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be one of the next questions, so maybe I'll ask that one first, because these next three questions were going to be quick fire questions. So every guest that does lemurs will be asked these same three questions, and a short 20-second answer one, so either yes or no or a short answer. So I'll start with the lemur one, because you just mentioned. How and when do you think lemurs arrived on Madagascar? And in particular, do you prefer a single or multiple arrival scenario? So I know the II sometimes is considered maybe there's a separate migration event. So yeah, I just wondering your opinion on those.
I think they arrived 55, maybe 60 million years ago, a really long time ago. I think there was one time that an animal arrived that was the ancestor of the lemurs. But it sure is true that the Daubentonia, that's the it split off first. And it's so weird and totally different in so many ways than the other lemur radiation. I mean, it has the largest brain size, of any of the prosimian primates, and it's has all these strange things that it does with its fingers and its teeth. It's got teeth that look like rodents.
Yeah, the ever growing incisors. It's
They
yeah,
really,
weird primate.
it's very, very weird. And of course, it's its teeth are located like where cows are, down by its hind legs instead of up under their arms. Very different than any other lemur or any other primate. And it's it just moves quickly in the middle of the night. Found sometimes on the forest floor. We see them because logs fall down, and trees fall down, and they like to eat grubs inside of trees. They're just amazing animals.
And I think I know your answer for this one because you've already mentioned it. But when did humans first arrive on Madagascar?
Well, according to our paper in Science Advances, 10,000 years ago.
Could you see it going further back and then multiple waves of humans?
It seems like we would have some evidence of that. And there's just no evidence of, and we don't have those humans. We don't have evidence except the cut marks on the bones. I'd like to just find one bone and see who those people were related to. It's the fossils were found in the center of Madagascar, so that it wasn't like people just came in for lunch and left. I mean, they would have had to walk in any direction. They would have had to work, a week or so to get to that spot if they came from the coast. So I think they were settled there. I don't know. It's a lot of mysteries to find out answers to.
Maybe you'll find in your new cave sites. Maybe there'll be some more evidence.
That would be wonderful.
And another fossil-related question: do you think the extinction of fossil giant lemurs was primarily due to human activity, climate change, or a combination of both?
I think from the evidence that we have, it was humans that destroyed the habitat that they were living in, and also humans that butchered them. So I think it was because of humans. It's not an accident. It's only the big ones that are gone extinct. And from the top of Madagascar to the bottom of Madagascar, we have fossils in the west, and the same fossils, and almost all of them, the hippos particularly, and the lemurs have cut marks.
The final question was: so these are always going to be something outside of research, but related to your work. So I was going to ask you about your work with the creation of the Centre ValBio. So could you describe your role in establishing the national park, the Ranomafana National Park, and the setting up of the Centre ValBio, and why you think it's important to have research infrastructure within local communities within Madagascar?
Okay, so first of all, to make the national park, we joined up with the forestry department and worked on where the boundaries were going to be. We walked around to the communities and talked to them about their ideas of where the boundaries should be, and then we worked with the government to establish it. And it would, it took a while. It took like 3 years, and then finally, it was the national park was established in May 1991. And I realized, and then we continued to be the managers of the park, and actually didn't turn it over to the Madagascar National Park Service until 1998. And then it was in 1998 that I realized, okay, they're doing the management of the park, but we still need to do research. And it rains a lot in Ranomafana, almost 4 meters a year. And if you're a research scientist, your equipment gets quite wet, and you do too. So I realized that we needed a structure to keep our equipment dry. And then I realized that, there's so much biodiversity in that forest. We needed a place where we could house people that studied frogs and birds and plants and lemurs. And so we started building a larger one. Then internet came, right? And we had to have internet. And then genetics came, and then we had to have -80 freezers and liquid nitrogen producing machines. And so pretty soon we have a world-class research station there. And I'm very, very proud of it. And I realize now that research stations are kind of like engines of conservation. Why? Because if you have a research station, that means you've got long-term data. You can keep monitoring to get a handle on climate change and changes that are occurring. If you have a research station, you can work with communities long term. And so we have an education team, and we have a reforestation team, and we have a health team. So, we're working with 75 villages now, and with the headquarters as the research station. We can also, filmmakers like to plug in and charge their equipment. So they're happy to be at a research station. So we have an IMAX film that we made, and we have Juliette Binoche actually filmed making pandemics there, and Anthony Bourdain came to do he's I think a TV star in the States anyway. And so there's people from all over the world who've come to also make films, and that allows people to be more aware of the incredible biodiversity that we have in Madagascar. So that's a good idea. I think having research stations it's as I said, it's a headquarters. It's a place that can be continued long term to get research. We have an incredible database where we can put together the information that we have on the frogs and on the plants and the behavioral data and the weights and measurements of the lemurs and how they interact. Everything can be put together into a relational database. So I love this idea of having a research station. I'm very proud of it. And we're building an endowment to make sure that it's going to be there in the future. And that's what my latest project is working on getting money to make it my legacy.
Thank you so much, Professor Wright, for doing this interview. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much, too.